Welcome to episode 8 of the Sonic Alchemy Scent Talks. I am, for anyone who's new, who's watching this episode for the first time and not watched any of my others, I'm Clancy. I'm the perfumer at Sonic Alchemy Scent Art. I am the founder and I do all the creative work behind the brand and I write all the little letters and handwritten notes that come with all the scents that I make as well. And now I also do all the handmade watercolor paintings that come with all the scents, which I've started to do since COVID as just an extra hobby. It's a great way to play with color and it's a great challenge. So today, as I've just said, is episode number 8. And I only have 2 more to go. So if there's anyone who's watching who's missed any of the other ones, I encourage you, if you're interested, to go back to the old ones and to make sure you tune in for next week's and the week after, the last 10th one. So today I have another really exciting episode. I'm going to be talking about my perfume BennuRH48, which I haven't talked about yet, and I am really excited to do that. And to kick things off, I'm going to do another reading. And so this one for today is, again, from Perfume Legends French Feminine Fragrances by a guy called Michael Edwards. Really highly recommend it. There's no other book quite like it. I think he may have made a more contemporary version of this book recently, but I'm not sure. I have the original one, which kind of goes from 1880s down to the 1990s. So I'm going to read a little bit of a section that I found this morning, and it's about a guy called Francois Coty, and he was a man born towards the end of the 19th century and in Corsica, and he was really pivotal in developing modern perfume as a fully fledged kind of boldly expressive medium. He did a lot in the marketing of perfume and in changing the way that we approach the bottling of perfume and that kind of sort of bringing together perfume as a whole experience rather than just a thing in a plain bottle, I suppose. So I found this little section. This section I'm going to read from is actually about a perfume that was his first classic one, called, I don't know if you guys can see, yep, called La Origine, The Origin. It was released in 1905, so it's quite a old perfume now, very old. It's almost 2 decades older than Chanel No. 5, 15 years or so older than Chanel No. 5. I love talking about these older perfumes. Partly because no one knows them really. They're very hard to find. A lot of them only exist either as a sort of secondhand chance encounter or in some museums, perfumery museums, they exist. And it's a very different time, obviously, in the world, and I think talking about the perfumes that were sort of released in the first few decades of the 20th century gives you a great idea of the birth of perfume as something that has real creative magic to it. So I'm going to read this little bit about his perfume La Origine, and you'll have to excuse me, there's a lot of French sounding words which I can't quite figure out how to pronounce, but I'm going to read this little section about his sort of first famous perfume. By 1904, Coty was ready to launch his first composition, La Rose Jacqueminot. Robert says that it was built around an accord of rose absolute with 2 synthetic bases. Rhone Poulenc's Rodinol, still a very common ingredient in perfume, a combination of the main constituents of rose and geranium oil, and Delair's Ionone, based on a synthetic violet chemical discovered by Timon and Kruger in 1898. Thanks to the synthetic bases and the strength of the rose absolute, La Rose Jacqueminot offered an originality and a tenacity quite unlike any other rose perfume then available. It is said that the perfume was named after the Jacqueminot dispensary for which Coty worked, but Christiane Coty, which is his daughter, recalls a popular cabbage rose named after General Jacqueminot, one of Napoleon's staff officers. The origin of the name, however, is less important than the fact that the perfume created history, with more of a splash than a bang. Coty's wife, Yvonne, used her millinery talents to create some lavish, exotic boxes made of satin and ribbons. Armed with a few bottles of his new perfume, says Robert, Coty approached Le Grand Magazine du Louvre, at the time the most prestigious department store in Paris. The head buyer criticized the fragrance and refused to stock it. By accident or design, probably by design, since he was very resourceful, Coty dropped a bottle in the main entrance. So many customers commented on the wonderful perfume and asked where they might buy some. So the buyer was obliged to send for Coty. That same evening, my father received an order for 12 bottles to be delivered that following day, says his daughter. It was a case of roses to riches. When we started, we were very, very far from being rich, Yvonne Coty told Jean-Jacques Vinant, former general manager of the house. We sometimes had only a croissant for lunch outside on a park bench. La Rose Jacqueminot allowed us to put butter on our croissants. Despite his brief training at Curis, which was sort of, I guess, just a perfumery, Coty could not pretend to be a qualified perfumer. However, according to Rudnitska, he had an innate gift for perfume and its harmonies. Although Coty lacked both the experience and the capital to compete with the other perfumers of the time, he was willing to experiment. More importantly, he was willing to use the new synthetic bases and natural absolutes that other perfumers viewed with caution. La Rose Jacqueminot was followed in 1905 by 3 new perfumes, Ambre Antique, La Jessie, and La Origin, says Robert. La Origin was not only the first Coty masterpiece, but also the first floral oriental perfume. It set the trend for 90 years of sweet, spicy floral interpretations. Le Bleu, which was 1912, Bal à Versailles, which was 1962, Oscar de la Renta, which was 1978, Vanderbilt, which was 1982, Poison, which was 1985, Lulu, which was 1987, Boucheron, which was in 88, and Toucade, which was in 94. Are just some of the fragrances which followed in La Origin's footsteps. So that actually focused much more on the rose perfume, the La Rose Jacqueminot one, more than La Origin, but explains sort of a bit about Coty and a bit about sort of his early origins. And it's important to consider something that's quite interesting and shocking for a lot of people to consider now, is that at that time, sort of right at the turn of the century, a lot of these new materials were coming out, things that smelt of, things that were helping perfumers to widen their palette of odors and helping them to interpret and reimagine the smells of nature in different ways. And perfumers were scared out of their skins to use these materials. they're very, they were more challenging to use. They reacted very differently in a perfume. A heavy hand could create a kind of disaster compositionally, and so people like Coty who embraced these changes really, really fast and were capable of being curious and weren't Coty wasn't kind of going against the norm in a lot of perfume. Coty wasn't a traditionally trained perfumer, and so his ability to encourage to sort of focus more on the freedom and less on the formal technique of perfume making allowed him to combine these rich, amazing natural ingredients with new synthetic ingredients, and sort of helping to push perfume past its primordial beginnings. So that's a lovely little bit. I'd recommend anyone to look up about Francis Coty. Unfortunately, I think later in his life he got into some unfortunate positions with sort of World War One and anti-Semitism and everything. I think he was a bit of a megalomaniac towards the end as well, but compositionally very interesting and very important to know for people who are interested in perfume. So I'm going to take a sip of water because I am dehydrated. And today my smell and tell is, I have a bit more of a show and tell part than the smell part today. But I have here a little jar of white frankincense. I'm gonna, if I can just hold it up to the camera. There we go. Yeah. So it's these little globule bits that are the resinous part of the exudation from a tree that is usually found in the southern Arabian Peninsula, so Oman and Yemen traditionally. The frankincense tree also grows in the Horn of Africa, so Somalia, that kind of corner. But the frankincense that comes from that part of the world, as opposed to the frankincense that comes from Yemen and Oman, is much cheaper. I have a feeling that's what this stuff is. And at the moment, whenever anyone purchases any bottle of perfume from me, they get a little jar like this with some frankincense in it, and it has this beautiful sort of coniferous, piney scent with these minerally stone qualities and airy elements in this perfume I made for installation earlier this year. That was called Air. I used a lot of these kinds of notes to get that clear, transparent kind of oxygen note. So yeah, some frankincense. It's good as well because I don't think many people are familiar with what frankincense looks like, and it's nice to put a visual to the name, which is really exciting, I think. And so today I'm going to talk about BennuRH48. And there's a lot of different ways that I could go about talking about it, but I'm going to start off with its mythological element, which is most obvious in its name. So first things first, BennuRH was a perfume that was commissioned by my friend and patron Rachel, and it was my first proper commission. And so I worked on it from February to September of 2018, and it's quite an interesting idea and story because I met with her and we had a chat about the potentials for this scent, and she mentioned this trip that she had done many years before to Egypt. And she had brought back a little oil sort of blend, I suppose, that she had gotten from her trip to Egypt. And she still had a little bit at the bottom of the bottle. And I I ended up taking a very small amount of that and using it as the beginning theme for the perfume. And it had this, from memory, it had this beautiful, lush golden smell, with these resinous tones that were very evocative and very much a part of the Middle Eastern sort of approach to perfume, in my eyes at least. And so so that was sort of the beginning idea and inspiration for it. And was this sort of idea of reinterpreting these lost smells that were potentially ancient and very hard to find anymore. And I ended up reinterpreting this Egyptian oil that she gave me, and using that sort of as the heart note, I suppose. It was quite interesting as well because we ended up focusing in on these ideas of ancient beauty and sort of forgotten myths. And Egypt is obviously a country that really captures a lot of that. Bennu in its name, so the Bennu is actually a sort of mythological deity in ancient Egyptian religion, and it is the precursor for what then becomes the phoenix in Greek mythology. So the Bennu is a bird. Its actual sort of mythological associations are with things like the sun and rebirth and creation. I think it's sort of famously thought of as a deity that kind of created itself, and sort of dictated the formations of life to come. And interestingly, the word Bennu is related to an Egyptian verb, which is just WBN, I think, and that verb means to rise in brilliance or to shine. And so I also think that the mythological ties of how the phoenix, or in this case the Bennu, one and the same, how they tie together is based on the associative symbolic relationship of these creatures, these mythical creatures, to the sun, and sort of that rebirth, dying and being born from the ashes, and how that relates to the constant regenerative power of the sun, which is so interesting. I was reading about it just before doing this video. It's very cool. You tend to forget after a number of years about this kind of, some of the background stuff, because it kind of goes after time. But so another really cool part of the name is that Bennu is also the name of a very large asteroid that is found in what's called the Apollo group. I looked it up. It weighs nearly 80 million kilos, and it's on a sort of it's sort of a near impact asteroid. So it's quite a dangerous asteroid in terms of its relationship to Earth. There are going to be, and have already been, some close encounters with the Bennu asteroid, but it's very interesting. I kind of like how it has both that cosmic connotation and the myth and the sort of idea, because it's also quite interesting because the Bennu is believed to connect to what was called the Bennu heron, which was a bird that lived kind of where Saudi Arabia is today, and the bird was nearly 2 meters tall. It was this massive kind of this massive extinct bird that I think the Bennu ended up kind of being based on. So there's some really interesting ideas for sure, and it's kind of combining Middle Eastern ancient sort of scent ideas and lots of interesting myth to this perfume. And so I think one of the things that we really tried to hone in on with this scent was the fact that it needed to be complex and at the same time quite refined and capturing a lot of different things at once, like a lot of my other perfumes do. So I sort of, as I mentioned, I started with this Egyptian oil, which had these kinds of sandalwoody resin tones to it. And what I ended up doing was creating two separate heart notes. So I begin with the heart note of the perfume almost always, and ended up starting with two separate heart notes. One being based on this sandalwood idea with a resin called benzoin resin, which has a lot of these lovely sort of smoky vanilla tones with some amber, some sweet amber, and then sort of having the separate idea coming in with a few things in common, having that sandalwood and the amber, but taking out the resin and adding a white musk component that I use a lot. I've used it in Dossier and that kind of thing, my other perfume, Dossier. And putting those together and like having them phase over the top of one another, and having them sort of kind of push where the other pulls and does that kind of tension and release thing over one another. It ended up making it very full and finished. So that was sort of how we built the core of it. What's also interesting about Bennu, and this is something that is found in a perfume called Shalimar, which was launched in 1925, I think, where the heart note of this perfume is actually also the base note of the perfume. So you have a structural sort of difference as opposed to having a heart note, a top note, a base note, having them all work independently. Bennu actually works in a way where you have a heart note that runs down and is deep enough to carry itself as a base note as well. Just a sort of subtle difference there as well. And this was also, importantly, for me, was the first time that I ever really got to work with sandalwood in a way that was really kind of don't hold back anything. I had worked with it a number of times before, but I consider Bennu to be my first real sandalwoody perfume, and it contains an almost like astronomically insane amount of pure sandalwood oil from a place in South India called Mysore. And so that's another unique little part of it for people who geek out on sandalwood. It's quite the perfume in that regard, I think. And sort of going along with that Middle Eastern theme as well, we ended up bringing in things like lotus flower. And I don't know how many of you have had the chance to really smell a lotus flower in the wild, but it's a really, really cool experience. And so I built on this heart note that I was talking about just before with two components by themselves, this lotus flower that I was working with and this cardamom oil that I was working with. I had worked with the cardamom before when I had made Winston's a couple of years earlier. But this was the first time that I really got to show it off, I suppose. Really uniquely about this scent as well is that it's really, really uncommon now to find scents that don't have any kind of citrus in them. And Bennu is one of them. It's quite a rare thing. I only have two scents like that, Anskarad and Bennu, which have no citrus in them at all. And as a result, the component that has the cardamom and the lotus flower in it, that acts as that part of the composition gives that flight that the citrus would normally in other perfumes, I suppose. It's also a very, very warm, intensely robustly lush and warm core to the perfume. And so, not that many people know this, but in perfume we refer to spices as being, some spices as being cold and other spices as being warm. So clove and nutmeg and cinnamon are all warm spices. But things like cardamom are considered to be cool spices. Again, referencing temperature, it's traditionally, I think, a part of aromatherapy to do with how blood flow effects can be affected by using these different oils. And as a result, this cardamom with this lotus, it does that. It gives it a bit of a cooling effect, which helps to just sort of flesh out the potential gaps of the composition when I started. Again, also the symbolic use of the lotus is really, really critical. There is a fair bit of historical significance with lotuses in Egypt, particularly the hypothetical, like, hallucinogenic properties of I think the blue lotus in parts of Egypt. Not sure about that, but we ended up bringing in lotus again because it fitted so well with the with those ideas of the sun, like that I mentioned earlier. And obviously the lotus flower as well, for people who don't know, tends to be associated very deeply with the symbol of Buddha, and there's a big significance of the lotus flower and how it has its roots in the muck of the lake or of the pond, and how it grows up out of that and has that flower on the top of the surface of, sort of coming out from the darkness into the light. It's this very strong imagery, and just looking at some of my notes. And the other really unique part of this scent is sort of, I guess it's a secondary heart note part, is this hyacinth idea. So I use a, it's quite a weird thing to explain, but this perfume covers so many different areas that, and at the time it was my most complicated perfume that I had ever made, that it's funny to explain. But when I was talking with Rachel, we were talking about this presence of this hyacinth, and I had never worked with hyacinth flowers before. You can't get a natural oil from the flower, so that means that perfumers like me have to do research and gather different chemical components and blend them together and create effects evocative of the flower. Now, there's a bunch of different kinds of hyacinths. They have a really intense smell that tends to smell only good when you're quite a way away from it. Up close, it's very jarring. And I was more focused on this green hyacinth idea, sort of the budding parts of the young hyacinth. So I ended up combining these different ideas, some of which were really sharp green notes. So galbanum, which I mentioned before, which is a plant, sort of grass, native to northern Iran, has this beautiful, intense, sharp, piercing green scent that smells a lot like kind of dried grass, I guess, and maybe a bit of hay. It smells a lot like a field. And blending different sorts of floral elements in, and cyclamen flower, which is another one that I use a lot, sort of softening up and making these harsh green tones more alive, I guess, and not so aggressive on the rest of the perfume. There are other notes that I've brought in that are some really intense floral notes, because as I mentioned before, hyacinth can really has a real kick to it, and so that to me is one of the most interesting parts of the perfume, because I think about it like in terms of color and in sections. So you have this massive chunk of kind of golden yellow, vibrating, lush, warm, woody kind of softness with the heart note. And then on the top you have this thin green, neon green line that is just serious. It's a seriously unique note as well, especially to combined with this kind of perfume, because a lot of, from what I can tell, this style of perfume isn't known um, for its extravagantly green elements. So that's quite a unique bit. It's only there. I think I only ended up using maybe 0.3 of a gram of it in a batch, so it's not much. And you have to be really careful because I have made batches before of Bennu where I have added too much of the hyacinth note, and it smells like the perfect perfume for a elf or for some sort of elfin creature. It's quite interesting. I think of Lord of the Rings. I think of like the second Lord of the Rings movie when I smell this hyacinth idea. And so you end up with these lovely this mixture of like what's going on, these beautiful contrasts. And then the scent is just finished off with this black wood idea that it's present in my Black and Deep Red, which most people are familiar with. And then with a couple of different notes, one synthetic truffle note and another note called labdanum, which is from a Mediterranean rock rose, which also fits in mythologically to some of this sort of Egyptian stuff. There are some connections with Osiris and well, potential connections with Osiris and this labdanum rock rose idea, because it connects with ancient shepherds. And I can talk about that more, but that's a whole different myth. But and so it ends up being this sort of combination of many different sharply contrasting olfactory values, and that is Bennu. It's a really, really beautiful winter scent. So at the moment that I'm recording it, it's the middle of July, and it's a really, really perfect kind of robust perfume that has a lot going for it, not just from the perspective of a composition, but from the perspective of people who just like perfumes that give a lot and that say a lot and that are capable of being really worn out, I think, yeah. And yeah, I think that is pretty much all I have to say about Bennu. And I thank you so much for watching. And if you would like to, you can leave a review on my Etsy, which I will link both the Etsy links for Bennu and for the I'll link up the video. And it's also currently on 30% off sale on my Etsy, and so you can check that out if you'd like to. So yeah, I'll see you guys next week for episode 9, and I can't wait. So thank you so much. All right, guys, have a great week. See ya. Bye.